Morning all. A very cute Sicilian defence miniature happened in the Reykjavik Open when Marc Esserman, playing white, was playing against one of the top seeds in the tournament, David Navara, who's 2736, I think number 4 seed. So Marc Esserman, 2426, has been doing very well in the Reykjavik Open overall. So how would he do in this game? So let's see. Did he beat Navara very quickly? Am I just tricking you, showing from the black perspective? These questions and others will be answered soon. So Marc Esserman plays e4. Will he be playing the Morra-Smith Gambit? I do have his excellent book, Mayhem in the Morra, which I recommend. So I'm hoping that some of you can maybe check that out on Amazon. If you want a good system against the Sicilian defence, the Morra-Smith is interesting, or the Smith-Morra with d4. But Marc on this occasion played knight f3. Sometimes he doesn't play the Smith-Morra. So we have an open Sicilian here. So c takes, knight takes, knight f6, pretty standard stuff. And the most popular move, this high-class waiting move, the Najdorf variation a6. Now bishop e3, very popular. Knight g4. Bishop often goes to g5, but this is another viable move. Bishop going back to c1. Knight c6. And now players with white sometimes play bishop e2 or h3 is also popular, so we're still in well-trodden territory. Bishop e3, e6, and now g4. So there's an interesting construction here with h3 and g4. It looks to be very nice to maybe fianchetto the bishop and later g5. Black prevents the idea of g5 or tries to discourage it. Bishop g2, bishop e7. So at this stage of the game, it looks like a fairly pleasant position for white here. So at move 11. What could possibly go wrong here? Let's see, queen d2 was played. And David Navara doesn't really want to rush to castle kingside. He might be in danger with things like g5, white castling maybe first. He actually plays knight e5, so a bit provocative, but the knight's got knight c4 if it's kicked with f4. So white plays b3. This is a bit of a vulnerable piece, this c3 knight. I know it's protected by the queen, but you can imagine if black builds up on that c-file later, this will form part of a kind of one of my new terms that I'm thinking about, resource backbone. It's a slightly loose piece, so if black can build up on the c-file, there'll be like bonus points based on that c3 knight for c3 pressure, for the c-file pressure. But what does black do about this g5, which is now possible, or even f4 to dislodge the knight? A very logical move in the circumstance, which maybe looks a bit weird at first, g5. The knight wants to be kept on e5. But it looks as though, isn't there a big downside of playing g5 here? If white does play f4 and takes, isn't this pawn a bit vulnerable on this battery? Well, this is exactly what happened. So f4, g takes, bishop takes. So what about this downside? Has Navara created too much risk here? Well, as previously mentioned, this c3 knight is a good target potentially if only black can mobilize the queen side, put pressure down the c-file. It does something very radical here. He just does b5. He lets the h6 pawn go here. But you can see that on bishop takes, bishop b7, rook c8, and things like b4, actually e4 is going to be kind of vulnerable. White for the moment doesn't take on h6, he actually castles, and it seems as though in theory the f-file pressure might be good, but on the other hand this knight is quite protective on e5 of the f7 pawn. So black goes ahead and plays bishop b7. Black doesn't really want to give up the dark square bishop, he'd be weakening himself even more on the dark squares. But we finally have this material grab, bishop takes h6 here. So is there enough compensation for black here? And also, isn't there a kind of threat of bishop g7 on the cards as well? Isn't this useful? Well, maybe not, because bishop and queen are protecting f6 sufficiently at the moment, but it's something to bear in mind that the bishop hasn't just grabbed a pawn. It's made way for some other opportunities. We see Navara playing a pawn down here, but the pressure is evident. The rooks are both kind of activated in a way, and the bishop now actually drops back, not seeing any point perhaps to bishop g7. We have bishop e3, and then we see this kind of resource backbone that I mentioned, the idea that sometimes, even if it's not a totally loose piece, it's a slightly loose piece, it's a weakened square, and it just emphasizes often with tempo, the opponent's resources. So queen c7 with tempo. Or is it? Does white have to move the knight? If white moves the knight, in fact e4 will fall. This will be more than sufficient compensation, surely, taking a centre pawn and having given up a flank pawn, still with a huge knight on e5. So white perhaps calculated this position and thought that he could use the f-file and not have to move the knight, because that's a pretty critical thing actually here, to move the knight or not. So white reacts with g5. So who has seen further now, David Navara or Marc Esserman? Because if this knight moves, then e4 is not such a problem for white. You can imagine that the knights could potentially move now and things are covered a bit more. e4 is not dropping off immediately, and black still has to justify things, surely. But what we get in the game here is a very clever move indeed. Queen takes c3, and white takes on f6, perhaps expecting the bishop to move. But interestingly, another move was played here. I wonder if you can spot it if I give you 5 seconds starting from now. Okay, bishop takes f6. A slight nuance to the position. The queen's actually hitting a1. There's no time for rook takes f6. Queen takes a1. Check. Oh dear. This is not what was intended. And also this doesn't work. Queen takes. It doesn't seem to work. Rook takes. Hitting the bishop. And things could fall apart quite rapidly here. Things could get very nasty. You might think, oh, hang on, is there bishop d2? In this position, with the rook attacked, rook g3 is probably what the players saw. Rook g3 seems to be very good for black here. So on rook takes f6, we have bishop takes e4. If rook f2, we just build up on the g2 bishop, and that's winning the piece back, I believe. So yeah, bishop f2, we can even just take on g2, we're winning the piece back. Black is winning the piece back. So yeah, that seems to be one of the major issues here, rook g3, this g-file. Emphasize that. Otherwise, that would be troublesome for black. This would actually be pretty loss for black. So that's an important question. It seems to be absolutely working for black. This bishop takes f6. So, with that aside, queen f2 was played. And now we see a move which basically is with tempo, bishop h4 on the queen, because the knight's protecting f7. The queen moves, trying to protect e3 still. And here, a really interesting move, which causes actually resignation, It causes resignation. Just pinning the bishop, rook g8. White resigned here. You might wonder, why on earth would white resign here? Let's look at various possibilities here. If queen takes e3 and it's all falling apart, we can just take on d4, piece up. Or even more accurate, maybe take on g2 first, then take on d4. So that's totally out of the question. So after rook g8, if rook a d1, unfortunately there's bishop g5 here, skewer. So that would be pretty unpleasant. The queen's on f4 because there wasn't too many squares for the queen after bishop h4, and it's just a nasty target still after rook g8 for bishop g5 now. So it seems that e3 and d4 are under great pressure, but also e4 is potentially going to collapse as well. What else to suggest? Knight e2, hitting the queen. Here, a very powerful move includes queen takes c2, because then we're on e4. So if queen takes h4, Actually, we can take here on one of the bishop. That's pretty nasty. Bishop g5, infiltration with rook c2, and that's pretty crushing stuff. It gets to be horrible. This position, white's just losing material, etc. Just a piece down there. So that's pretty disastrous. Knight e2, queen takes c2, and if rook c1, you might think it's not a big deal. We can still just take on e2. It doesn't matter about temporary inconvenience here. Piece up. Yeah, it just occurred to me, it was a bit of a strange game. I didn't see how white could lose so quickly from what seemed to be quite a sensible looking position. Does it show how dangerous the c-file is, or how dangerous to take a pawn on the king side? It's kind of black's rooks. What struck me just from an aesthetic perspective was black's rook activity is like this position after getting this to work. If this works, I mean, it just seems lost here if this works, and it does seem pretty promising for black. Maybe the top move is actually just to take the queen and accept the losses. This doesn't seem too hot. This kind of thing. Yeah, black's just better. So given that works, but what is aesthetic about this is the rooks here are just so absolutely lethal, and the bishop. Absolutely every single piece of black is aggressive here. I thought that was a very interesting game just to do a quick presentation on. So I hope you enjoyed that. It just shows how dangerous the Sicilian defence is. But nevertheless, Marc Esserman had a great tournament, and remember, he's got a great book on the Smith Morra, which maybe he'll play next time against David Navara or against another 2700 plus opponent. Can't be worse than this, can it? Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.